Hey, hello everyone, good afternoon. You're live into the Palace of Westminster, Portcullis House, and Steve Brine, the chair of the All-Party Group for Childcare Early Education. Sorry, we're a few minutes late. We're just waiting to see if we're going to do our AGM, which we may just break off and do briefly if we get the chorus of members that we need to do that. It's just the way it is. So this meeting is our latest session. It's titled Inclusivity and How to Break Down Barriers in Childcare and Early Education, which is what we're all about. The EGM, if it happens, will only take a few minutes, and so we'll just crack on. The purpose of the meeting is, well, that's the title of the meeting. Just for those who are new, this all-party group is exactly what it says on the tip. It's made up of MPs and peers across all parties in Parliament, and we're here to support and promote the private, voluntary and independent, or PVI, short childcare settings, and ensure we got very best value, high quality early education to help our children in all our constituencies. And we meet pretty regularly, and we will have another session with the Minister at some point this year. So the theme of the session, inclusivity in the sector, how we can break down those barriers to ensure children with disadvantaged backgrounds, children with minority, and all children, of course, have access to high quality and affordable early education. We're going to consider ways to boost inclusivity in that PVI sector that I mentioned we're all about, be that financial reform, community outreach, form of benefits, or more targeted resourcing. We've got some really nice speakers, as we always do, and a lot of people online. So thanks for joining us from your busy schedules. We've got Shanti Flynn, who's the Head of Education at Storal and as a trustee at Pacey. We've got Josh Hillman, Director of Education at the Nuffield Foundation, Catherine McLeod, Chief Executive of Dingley's Promise, and Dawn Kiefer and Emma Jane Hassan, Early Education Leads at Reach Children's Hub. So I'm going to introduce those. People are going to speak. If they've got PowerPoint slides, they will come up and take over your screen at that moment. And I'm going to start with Shanti Flynn, Head of Education at Storal and a trustee at Pacey.
Thank you for inviting me to speak this afternoon. My name is Shanti Flynn and I'm Head of Education, as Steve said, at Storal. We operate 27 nurseries across the country as well as throughout the school clubs. And we work with 18 different local authorities in total. I'm also a trustee at Pacey, the Professional Association for Childcare in Early Years. What I'd like to share with you today is the reality of what our teams, our children and our families face on the ground on a daily basis. There have been many new initiatives to increase access and the uptake of early education, but unfortunately the headlines do not match the reality because, yet again, government is not putting the needs of our youngest children first. For example, the Early Education Recovery Programme recognises the challenges the sector faces post-COVID and has made some free training available. However, specific training to support children with additional needs is not universally available to all our settings. One of the remits of the Stronger Practice Hubs is a focus on supporting children from disadvantaged backgrounds. Across our 27 nurseries, we've only been able to access some training in the North, the Midlands and Blanford Forum. None of our settings in the South East or the South West of the country are in the right postcode to access this support, even though we have children and families from disadvantaged backgrounds. This inconsistency across the country is not just limited to the Education Recovery Programme. The biggest barrier to a truly inclusive early education offer is the lack of a national strategy, with local authorities making different demands on our providers. The revised Early Years Foundation stage states explicitly that assessment should not require extensive paperwork, but the burden of paperwork has just shifted from doing it for Ofsted to doing it for the local authority. As providers, we have to navigate different types of forms and use different screening tools to access additional support for our children. One local authority has insisted that we screen all our children using a welcome tool, even though there is already a statutory requirement for all providers to carry out a 2-year progress check to identify if children need extra support. Since 2015, the government has encouraged early years providers, local authorities and health visiting services to work together to combine the Healthy Child Programme review and the EYFS progress check at 2 years, known as the integrated review. This is definitely not happening as standard practice across the country. Pre or post-pandemic, Where it works best, for example, in our Willow Tree Nursery School in Clacton, the health visitor comes into nursery, completes the health check with the parent, the family, and the nursery person, and that's a really good standard practice. In other areas of the country, the do your progress check is just not asked for or shared with our colleagues in health. And in some areas, parents are sent a questionnaire to return, so health colleagues don't even see the child. When children are identified as having additional needs, families and providers are then faced with even more barriers to access additional support. In Kent, we are only allowed to submit 2 referrals to the local inclusion forum team per term. So that means 6 children per year. What if we've got more children that require additional help? And these decisions are made without actually seeing the child. It works well in Essex, where we have an inclusion partner that visits the nursery regularly to observe children, prepare reports for EHCP applications, and support strategies for children with SEND. And there is a similar service in Brighton and Hove, but this service only works during school term time, although many providers operate all year round. If you are lucky enough to make that referral list, and it's acknowledged that a child has additional needs or needs any intervention, then there are even more barriers. Waiting lists to be seen by professionals such as speech and language therapists are anywhere between 6 and 18 months currently. In Colville, there are currently 508 children on the speech and language list, with only 4 speech and language therapists who cover the whole of North West Leicestershire. Many local authorities also will not see children before they are 3. So it means once you've navigated the referral process and waited your turn on a 12-month plus waiting list, you're in school. So much for early intervention. More affluent families may have the option to go down a private route, but our vulnerable families may not have this option. A really good example of practice is in Hampshire, where nurseries have been assigned their own speech and language therapists to support educators with strategies to help children. The funding deficit is also a barrier to accessing and providing high quality early years education. Payment does not match the hours a child attends. A child can attend our nursery for 60 hours and claim free 30 hours childcare, not free, not 30 hours and not childcare, but that's a conversation for another time. The 30 hours is stretched across the year, so it is now only 22 hours per week. And a lot of local authorities will only fund 50% of these hours. So that now becomes 11 hours a week when the child is attending for 60 hours a week. Derbyshire has not increased its funding rate in the last 4 years. An example of good practice is Leicestershire, which allows us to claim group funding, which means that we can support several children at a time who may have similar lower level needs. The recruitment and retention crisis in this sector has only amplified the challenge for families seeking suitable childcare for their child with SEND. As providers, we sometimes have the capacity to take children, but not the staff to be able to support these children with more complex needs. I could go on, but I've been told to choose 2 recommendations. Next slide, please. The first would be a national strategy and greater integration at a local level, especially around the 2-year progress check and healthy child review to support early intervention. And the second is to review the deficit funding so that children with additional needs are not at a greater disadvantage. Thank you.
All right, sorry, you finished. Okay, that's very good. The numbers barrier, we're talking about barriers, weren't we? The literal numbers barrier, where the computer says no after a certain number, is something I suspect people will wish to explore, probably back up. I can't believe it's exclusive to your area, but thank you so much for that. Really interesting. Right, Josh, Director of Education at Nuffield Foundation. Thanks so much for being here, Josh. Everyone can see you and hear you.
For those who don't know, the Nuffield Foundation is probably the most independent funder of rigorous research in this area. And so in that context, I'm going to sort of zoom out and talk about some of the issues that Shanti's been referring to, but from the perspective of what the data shows at a national level and some of the headlines from that evidence and what some priorities from that might be for policy developments. And just start by saying there's really significant tensions in the system between the three broad purposes of early years education and childcare. It's improved employment for those who with very young children, particularly women. There's child development and foundational education for the whole cohort. And then there's tackling the gap in school readiness between advantaged and disadvantaged children. Those are three separate purposes. They lead respectively to different attributes in the system, where some of those tensions get expressed. So accessibility and affordability, particularly acute at the moment, with the financial pressures on both families and on providers. Quality and effectiveness of the early learning that takes place. And then question around universal against targeted approaches to funding provision. And I just don't think that the expanded funding envelope, which is announced in the budget, which is extremely welcome, particularly for many working families, makes it that easy for us to talk about inclusivity and equality without addressing some of those trade-offs in a more explicit way than we've probably done. Those trade-offs are particularly significant in a complex system where you've got a cumulative patchwork of private and voluntary providers and schools with attached maintained provision, childminders, and separate childcare centres as well. And then, of course, the complexity of the demand side of different entitlements and tax breaks and universal credit arrangements and parental funding. So all those interactions are very, very complicated. Whilst that big injection of funding is helpful, that dysfunctionality that is caused by that complexity is never going to be resolved until there's some sort of, one of Shanti's recommendations, quite a fundamental review. And I know this group made a recommendation about the commission. We used to have broad commissions. It's that kind of level of fundamental review, taking a step back. Now, this session, of course, is focusing on children rather than on the parental employment, which is important. What does the evidence show from the UK and overseas? Particularly interested in those sorts of longitudinal studies that compare children who go through early years provision to their counterparts, and also track them through childhood and beyond to see what the longer term effects are. There's studies like the APPG study and the SEED study, which is a more recent one, 10 years ago. Three overall headlines from that research evidence. One is it's only high quality provision that improves children's outcome, particularly if gains aren't going to wash out later in childhood. So the APPG study from the late 90s, early 2000s, when the children were in provision, shows the impact of attending high quality settings on areas like self-regulation, social and behavioural outcomes, and even then later on GCSE results. Secondly, it's disadvantaged children, whether in terms of their socioeconomic background or their specific learning needs, that most stand to benefit from early years provision, particularly those that start earlier, starting from the age of 2. And then third, the use of early years education is still highest amongst adult families, and policies that focus mainly on expansion of overall quantity of provision, and therefore aimed particularly at improving maternal employment, tend to be less successful at improving children's outcomes, and certainly are less successful in narrowing the gap for the most disadvantaged. So priorities, what should the priorities be? I would group them around 3 headings: quality, targeting and incentives, and more holistic services. What does high quality look like? That's all about strengthening the workforce, particularly in the private and voluntary sectors that represents the majority of provision, particularly for the under 3s. And that's about addressing poverty on 2 fronts: structural issues like the balance of group size and ratios, and how well qualified the staff are, and how sustainable the providers are. I would argue that raising ratios is only a good thing to do if you're upskilling and addressing recruitment and retention issues. And that's why I was quite interested in the government's thinking around friendships, degree level apprenticeships. It seems like a fruitful way of addressing that. And then the other aspect of quality is around the process, the curriculum, the pedagogical practices. And here I would point to more structured intervention programs that are well evidenced and help develop consistent relationships between the staff and their children. Second, around prioritising access and targeting funding for children. that benefit the most, children with SEND, children with English as an additional language, and how do you support providers to be able to deliver for those groups. Here I've looked to policies like the pupil premium. The early years pupil premium is so much lower, it's a tiny fraction of what you see for primary school and children. That's possibly an area that could be a good lever to pick that up. And also look at different practice in local authorities. We're funding some work at the moment that's exploring best practice amongst local authorities in supporting take up amongst the most disadvantaged groups. There's very good practice in some areas and not in others. So that evidence will be important to throw in as committee goes about its work. And then finally, just to recognise that early years education and childcare is only one tool in addressing children's development and their outcomes, and the gap in school readiness. And we need to think about the many hours that those children spend in their homes or in formal childcare or in their communities, and the context of other factors on their development, their family income, their neighbourhood, domestic family strains, financial strains, physical and mental health, and so on. And there's a, without wanting to burden early settings too much, there may be more exciting ways of getting those settings to play a wider role in children's development along the lines that I think the family hubs model is sort of aimed at doing some of that. It needs to be evaluated properly. I don't think Sure Start was evaluated well enough. We are still getting some interesting findings from the work that we funded around Sure Start about longer term outcomes of that programme, still both not just on education but on health outcomes coming through later, but there wasn't nearly enough research done into the different models of Sure Start, and I think it's an opportunity to do that around family hubs. I'll stop there, but I'm sure there'll be things we can question.
That's great, thank you. That's really helpful. Thinking, but all right, Catherine is not here, but she's up there somewhere. Hi, Catherine.
Hi, I'm here. Sorry, I can't be there today.
All right, it's hot here.
You're happy not to be on the tube?
No, you want to be, yeah.
And Catherine, can you see your slides?
There you go.
Yes, I can now. Yeah.
Hi,
Okay.
So this is Catherine McLeod, everyone. Chief Executive of Dingley's Promise. She's MBE. She's had that for quite some time. They're all the rage these days, apparently. But depending on who you once knew. But she's had hers for years. She's had hers for years. Well deserved. Go ahead.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, so yeah, today I'm going to talk about children with SEND in the early years and just a bit around meaningful inclusion, the current situation, the impact that has on families, what the barriers to inclusion are, and what needs to change, and therefore why the government should prioritise those changes. Next slide, please. So yes, I'm from Dingley's Promise. We're an organisation that runs specialist centres for children and their families. We also have a national training programme that's training mainstream settings to be more inclusive in the way that they work with children with SEND. And finally, we are very active now in influencing as well and involved in lots of things I won't tell you about in this short time. Next slide, please. So from the national background of what's happening at the moment, so recent research from the Early Years Alliance has some quite alarming figures. 73% of settings are saying the number of children with SEND is rising, and across the board from all the work we're doing nationally, certainly that is what settings are saying. 28% of settings had turned children with SEND away. Again, this is something that is rising at the moment, and certainly in the last year, I would say there's a lot more open discussion about settings not feeling comfortable or confident to take children and keep them safe in many cases. So that is something that is growing and is being discussed more. And 92% of settings, and this is terrible, 92% of settings have had to use their own funds to support children with SEND in the early years. And I think what we all know that our sector is in a financial crisis, and in the situation that you're a setting that's struggling, if you are faced with a child with SEND and a child who doesn't have SEND wanting to come into your setting, and you're not being able to access funding effectively, and you know you're going to have to spend it out of your own pocket, it becomes a situation where settings who would love to be supporting those children feel that they don't have the option to do that. And that's something we have to look at and we have to improve, so that settings are not disadvantaged and that the costs that they have and the support that they need is there. Next slide, please. Oh no, next, just click it, please. Ooh. And it is by magic. Only 18% of local authorities believe they have enough provision for all children with SEND in the early years. This is a stat that's just come out from Coram and is reflected on all the work we're doing with local authorities across the country. It's a major issue because obviously the local authorities aren't confident that they have that provision. And you can see you've got rising demand, you've got capacity falling, and what that means is that it's leading to this really serious lack of provision for children with SEND in the early years. Worst case scenario, they don't get supported in the early years and they stay at home. Next slide, please. Around the impact on families, obviously it is huge, and there are various impacts. The one that's been talked about in government a lot is around employment, and certainly families do tell us they want to be employed, they want to be able to earn money, and evidence shows that it's more expensive to have a child with SEND anyway. So, you know, it's really critical to those families. But also 1 in 5 say that isolation has led to a breakup of their family life, and 72% say it's led to mental ill health. And I really wanted to focus on families because it is families who are going to be the key to us having a better system and a more inclusive system. Because if families don't trust the system, they will not be choosing inclusive practice, they will be choosing assessment, they will be choosing EHCPs, and they will be choosing special education. So we have to really, really support families more effectively than we do now. Next slide, please. So the main barriers to education, one major barrier I've mentioned is paperwork. So when the EYFS changed to focus less on paperwork for all children, while that is a good thing, it's made a huge difference in the amount of paperwork needed for children with SEND and other children. And as settings are struggling anyway, it becomes a disincentive to take children. The funding systems are complicated and there are key exclusions. 2-year-olds aren't covered. Many local authorities will fund 15 hours for a child with SEND, but not 30 with extra funding. So again, those funding systems need to be looked at very carefully. Recruitment and retention, we've talked about a little bit. So obviously you need staff in the room, you need staff who are, you know, continuity in staff, because children with SEND especially need that continuity. So that will affect how they're feeling in the setting. But also, as was mentioned earlier, we need specialist staff, and there's a shortage in specialist staff, which is causing a delay in therapy and in early interventions as well. Next slide, please. I'm trying to rush. So what needs to change? We really, really need more focus on sufficiency for children with SEND. Local authorities need to know, are they sufficient or not in the early years for children with SEND? If they don't know those numbers, they don't know what the size of the problem is, and they're not taking it seriously enough. So that is something we really need to have, and we really need to look at carefully. Simplified processes for applying for financial support. Settings should not be disadvantaged by taking children with SEND. The cost should be met, and it should be easy to access those costs. Training on inclusive practice for all practitioners. Again, new policies are talking about the level 3 SENCO. It's important to have a level 3 SENCO, but again, families are saying what they really want is every practitioner to understand inclusive practice, every practitioner to feel confident to be able to deliver that for children. And then finally, real engagement with and respect for families. That really, really has to be there. We've had some high profile cases in local authorities recently, not mentioning any names, but we have to get families to trust the system of SEND support so that they will actually trust that and not be aiming for EHCPs and special education as a first option. So last slide, why should government prioritise this? Without family trust, you can't have inclusion. Without knowing the size of the problem at local authorities, you can't solve the problem. If you sort out the early years and the spending is there to support those children, then you take a lot of pressure off the rest of the education system. and also a large group of underemployed people. The families of those children will be employed and again contributing nationally. All of that is obviously underpinned by the fact that we need the best start for all of our children with SEND, which is critical. But I hope that, last slide, hope that is of some use. Please do contact me if you want to talk about it further. Sorry for overrunning.
No, you did not. Catherine, just a quick clarification. 3 and 4 parents have had to give up work because of a lack of support for their child. Is that 3 and 4 parents of a child with SEND? Or with,
Yes.
with an EXCP? Or how are you defining that 3 and 4?
3 and 4 parents with a child with SEND. That was according to the Disabled Children's Partnership research.
Yeah. No, it's just because it was from the Disabled Children's.
Very high, yeah.
I was just trying to get the definition right. Okay, fine. Thank you for that. Very good. Anyway, we're back in the room, as they say. Dawn, Kiefer, and Emma Hassan, early education leads at Reach Children's Hub. Reach for the stars. Right, there's a song there.
Thank you for inviting. Before Emma and I begin our presentation, I'm going to introduce.
So hi, I'm Ellie. I've recently finished my honours degree in early years education, hoping to go into early years teaching in September, and I've been in early years for 10 years now.
I'm Keely. Hi, I'm currently working in a nursery in a school setting. I've had my level 3 in early years childcare. And I'm currently just finished level 4 on my way to level 5 to complete the early years foundation. And I've been working in early years for almost 17 years.
Good. Well
No,
done.
I don't.
Possible. You fit for it. I was about to say how is that possible? You could do that. Right, please. Yeah. Cool. Right.
Hello, my name is Emma. I'm an early years educator working with 3 to 5 roles. I have worked in early years for over 8 years. I have a level 3 childcare diploma and I'm currently doing my level 4 and 5 in the foundation degree, where I will gain my level 4 and 5. Oh, thank you.
My name is Dawn. I'm an early years educator working with 2-year-olds. I've worked as an early years educator for over 10 years. Although I am a graduate with an early years degree and I'm about to start my master's in research, my earnings are the same level as a level 3 early years educator. There is little pay increase or progression within the sector. The majority of us do not receive the living wage of £10.42. This is not okay. Our role is simply not to teach. We nurture, we care, we give a piece of ourselves. It's not just a job. There is an element of emotional labour that comes when caring for children. Furthermore, 90% of brain development happens within the first 5 years of a child's life. And so it's important time for a child's educational journey. Almost half of the attainment gap at 16 is already in place before children start school, and a child's development by 22 months serves as a strong predictor of educational outcomes at age 26. However, we are not recognised as the experts in our fields or the professionals that we are.
Despite my contributions to the early years sector, such as the knowledge, qualifications and impacts I have on all the children I work with, my wage is so low that I cannot afford a mortgage. My salary does not reflect my professional qualifications and the pressures of my role. It is a very demanding job and I deserve to be paid a fair salary. But we know that our stories are not unique to us. The childcare workforce earned an average hourly pay of £8.20 in 2018, 40% less than the average female worker.
So we've been running a listening campaign in Feltham, West London, to find out more about the experiences of our colleagues in the area. We asked over 35 early years professionals from a range of settings the question, what is putting pressure on you or those around you in the early years sector? And their comments were incredibly insightful. We would like to share our findings with you.
Four themes that came up time and time again was the SEND support. There is an increase in the number of children needing support in the earlier sector, but we do not feel supported enough to cope with this. Reputation, we do not feel valued by the wider society. Recruitment and retention. There are many challenges to recruit and retain highly qualified educators. Pay underpinning all of these themes was the low salaries of early years educators. I'm going to give you a minute to have a look at those.
We're just going to scan it up and put it on the
Yeah, brilliant, thank you.
chat for those.
Lovely.
We're just a handout that's in the room for those that are online. It's 56 people now, and we just scanned it on phone, and we're going to send it onto the chat. Yeah.
Yeah. If we continue on.
Continue on.
Yeah, brilliant.
These findings are very concerning and not unique to Felton. If we want our children's earliest experiences of education and care to be the highest quality, we need educators who feel valued and can make a fair living. If not, people will leave and no one will want to replace them.
This issue is very important to us. Our next step is to listen to more people in the sector. We are presenting Kingston University's Festival of Learning in a few weeks' time and are working with Save the Children's UK campaign and marketing team. We are absolutely clear that what is needed is the living wage as a basic expectation for all early years educators. And so we will be focusing on this as a campaign. Thank you for listening.
We would love to invite you to Felton so that you can see the work that we do in the families that we work.
Do you get support from your MP?
Yeah, we've got. Yeah.
It's good.
She's shown support.
Okay, that's great. Look, ask in a minute whether there's any questions in the chat or people want to put their hands up in the room. Starting with our two peers, we're in Baroness Andrews. But, I mean, the theme through a lot of what you said, certainly our first three speakers, was around the budget. Obviously, was big on. I thought actually, Josh, you put it really well. The focus is very much on quantity, wasn't it, in the budget, expanding the offer. And I understand why, because I'm a politician and I understand that that's the retail offer, if you like, heading towards an election. But the point that you were making was that kind of misses the point. It might hit the nail on the head, but in some ways it misses the point, especially about the issue that we're discussing today. Is that a fair comment?
It misses a point. I mean, I think it's probably, you know, if you're looking to fit in better with work patterns for those who want to return to work fast, it tends to be women. Then longer hours, not having them concentrated within term time that's spread throughout the year. So the more hours you can have, the more effective that is. But it disincentivizes settings to either target disadvantaged children, particularly those who are from families who are working, and it also lowers the kind of it increases the pressure on the workforce, recruiting enough, training them enough. So there's a tension.
Yeah. Okay. Well, did you wish to ask a question or
yeah, probably put it this way, somewhere between questions and comments.
That's of course right.
I think the presentation has been very worthwhile. Just the areas to touch on the issue. I think you're very much right in terms of the issue of trying to provide universality and uniformity. I suppose for coming from experience in Northern Ireland, we have the advantage and there are benefits to having a single education authority covering all of them, and maybe our common wage scale. I think that we still have echoes of previous arrangements where we have more geographically sort of specific areas to everything that. So it's a problem. And we find, for example, that it meant that some of the things were in a much better position to react to quickly and more effectively, for instance, during the COVID pandemic. Maybe to take one example, which meant we didn't have to work through local authorities. So if the issue around holiday hunger, I don't know, was beyond the early year side of things, we were in a position because effectively through the One Education Authority, essentially it will be making arrangements to initially about 97% of those who are entitled that could then get it by way of a single payment once a fortnight and able to do that very quickly. One thing I would say is I think getting a national approach I think is very helpful. And one thing I think we also need to be aware of, again, we would find from our experiences, the very good cooperation at the level of departmental level of education and health. There's statutory legislation there in terms of children's cooperation side of things. It's important, I suppose, that when even uniformity is rolled out, that actually what is happening on the ground matches what is at the higher level. We find sometimes a disconnect between practitioners, particularly on the health side, with education, irrespective of the fact it's supposed to be the same everywhere. Second issue, I suppose, just is I think that in terms of early years, there's a clear need for proper buy-in in government. And what I mean by that is government have different views, but quite often very easily accept the mantra of early intervention is critical. Taking that to the next level of embedding that, I think sometimes can be difficult, and in particular with the fact that quite often early interventions are very good schemes, but are not maybe there say on a statutory basis. And what it does mean is that at any occasion, which happens frequently, I suppose, in government, where there's big financial pressures, it then tends to be the difference in the formula of the cuts. We'll see that, so how we can embed that, and also within that, particularly in terms of for early years, the issue of underachievement and low attaining communities, getting that direct community buy-in, whether that's a particular sector or a geographical community, is critical. Again, I think if you're getting on the ground, people being directly involved as opposed to it's being top down from the government. And so the final point that we make on the issue of SEND, I think it's also absolutely critical. The issue of sufficiency has been mentioned. I think there's a high level of critical quality in SEND for the planning. Again, from the Northern Ireland perspective, we have probably relatively high levels of diagnosis, high levels of intervention on that basis. I think we shouldn't kid ourselves on what is out there in any jurisdictions sufficient at present. There's actually demand is going to be, there's no doubt, judging from the level we're actually, our figures are probably much higher than they are in the rest of the UK. We're actually, there's a rapidly moving targets on that basis. And without forward planning, I know, again, from personal experience, even with higher levels of support that's there, there has been a scramble each year with trying to ensure that there are sufficient places that are available, that there are sufficient physical, and it's almost each year, it's almost a crisis comes up at the beginning of each school year or whatever in relation to it. And a lot of that is the long-term effect, probably not projecting that in terms of forward planning. So those are more observations that we may want very finely just to commend the people, particularly over the years, and in terms of particularly attainments. So I think there's a very good work done by a panel of experts on sponsored the Department of Education in Northern Ireland 2021 for the first start, which looked particularly at dealing with the attainments. Yeah, and I suppose particularly with the key recommendations actually and the oriented things that those the benefits of early intervention. On that basis, I would commend that.
Well, that's very good. Very insightful thoughts. Did anybody wish to comment on those or bringing Baroness Andrews? Okay. You wanted to make a point about it.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Councilman. I'm trying to be sure. It's absolutely as much of the real this your first one experience. It makes huge difference in the authority of the community representation in both houses. Just as an aside, Steve, please forgive me, but in 1975, I took those parliamentary in the hospitals. I tried to set up a crash in the hospitals. Because I went, I was special in the first trial, and we were all women, imagine, all about the same. It took nearly 25 years. We almost got it done, in 1975, a lot of sympathy for it. We had it all mapped out. I knew exactly where it was going to be. I knew what we did. But they lost courage, and we wasted so many years. And I think eventually, I suppose, started in 2000. So I've got a vested interest in what we do. I've also spent some of my other life actually in the larger sector, working in these sorts of issues, particularly with schools and the relationship between early years and primary schools and attainment. I think in order to strengthen the case for childcare between now and the next election, I think there are certain things actually which we think hard about how to do. And one of it is about evidence, actually. And I think the evidence of the failure of the recovery program, and the impact that it has on its children, is really important. The more information we can get out on that, especially actually as it's affected children with disabilities and disadvantage, because the statistics you presented today are really shocking. I know we haven't come to the end of the short start evaluation, but that gives us a longitudinal stretch. So if we are in a position to say that those children who did have best advantage are now really performing higher, as they go into A-levels, we need to be monitoring evidence as powerfully as possible. The second thing is to try to present the case for scaling up the best, optimizing the best. You quoted Leicester, Hampshire, lots of local authorities where there's really good practice. And the question is why, what do they have in common? Leadership, are they spending no money? Are they spending it in the same sort of ways? Are they working on different business ways? You have different partnerships with these local authorities. If we know that there's half a dozen elements which really make a difference, then we can convene local meetings with other local authorities to say, look, this is within reach. You're all in the same boat. All of you have got in a supplementation. These are the things you can do. So, and it's only people like you can provide information like that for us to use and run with. So that's another area in which in the next year we really hard evidence. And finally, actually, what is working well. It is absolutely fundamental to the whole economy and the cohesion of society that we do better. I know the Childcare Act 2017 was a predictable disaster and we set out this practice. But it's not a million miles away from child and other social care and the situation of social care. The integration issue is a really, really important, and that's part of modeling the good practice. So we need to be able to say as a whole, the care economy underpins the real economy. It is part of the real economy. And this is a serious investment, which will make the difference between, what's on the forward and afterwards. So it's a much bigger picture. And I know you're in the middle and you've got really powerful issues. I mean, the living wage figure is we can do things with that. We can make more people understand the significance of that. But I think over the next year, especially I think giving more evidence to show what happens to children who are not school ready, either because of COVID or because of their child provider has dropped out or they've been excluded from reasons. It's a big job to be done.
I know. I'm going to have to move on because I've bring some people in that are up on the screen, but we'll get kicked out of the room very soon. But thank you.
Absolutely.
I love your story of the nursery. I won't tell you how old I was in 1975. I'm serious. Not very old at all. Right, Emma Coma.
Yeah, hi.
Go ahead.
Hi. I'm owner of a very large kindergarten. I'll try and talk quickly. So I want to very quickly give my perspective on the overall picture. I'm also a trustee of the Early Years Alliance, and I have a meeting tomorrow morning with Neil Leach on the very subject I'm very quickly going to touch on. I'm not going to pull any punches. The government's announcement of more free funding coming in the next year or two means that everything that's just been discussed is going to get 100 times worse. The early years in this country is going to go into absolute disaster. And what the government has actually done is going to increase demand, whilst at the same time massively reducing the capacity of early years. There's going to be closures, there's going to be reduction in the amount of sessions, there's going to be nurseries pulling out of funding. Free funding does not work, even for the 2, 3 and 4-year-olds. Bringing it down to 9 months is going to force the whole of early years into absolute crisis, and everything we've discussed tonight is going to get 100 times worse. Please listen to us. All it needed to be to encourage more parents to work and make childcare cheaper is it needs to be a subsidy. Even if you came up with a great rate for all nurseries, they operate out of different premises, in different areas, they've got different costs. That will never work. And we all know it will always be underfunded. So this means the government's pledge to get more families back to work is going to backfire massively. And the headlines are going to actually say, it's not about we can't afford childcare. As a working parent, we can't get any childcare, so we can't work. And I'm afraid that's the reality. Thank you to all the speakers, but I do not have a good feeling about this next year or 2 or 3 for the early years sector. Thank you.
Any other hands up? I can't see it.
I can't seem to find my hand, Steve. Well, the hand on the screen, but just to say, in line with what Emma just said, the history shows every time there's an increase in free entitlement, the provision for children with SEND decreases. So I too am absolutely terrified about what's going to happen next.
Such a good point. It's such a good point, well made. That's why that's the theme of today's meeting, because we're just trying to. I mean, the All-Party Group is about collecting thought from across the House and across the sector, and then feeding that through me and members into debates in the House that are then heard by the ministers. And everybody knows that we had an All-Party Group meeting with all of the sponsors post-budget. And the challenge that there is, I'll bring you in a minute, Roz, is that there's lots of people in government who are very pleased with themselves about the budget. And there are lots of MPs who are very displeased with me for taking a half full approach to this. Whereas I'm not interested in a half full or a half empty. I'm interested in a realistic response, because otherwise I'm not really doing my job, am I, as chair of the All-Party Group? There's no point in me hearing one thing and then saying another. So I suggest that you make sure that you make these points, all of you that are on the call. I know you, Catherine, you do, make these points to your MPs, because I'm one of the few voices here who's trying to be realistic, on my side, that is, about the budget. Anyway, Ros.
Hello, I'm Ros Lambert. I'm the Chief Executive of First Steps, which is a charity that has 2 community nurseries and an early years specialist service. And I just want to back the comments that Emma's just made wholeheartedly, and add to that the other group of children who are going to suffer from the proposed increase in the early years entitlement is children from deprived families, and that they will really struggle to find places even more, and that will just narrow the gap in achievement. I just wanted to make that point, and thank you for listening.
No, thank you, Ros. Again, it's a point well made, and Steve just touched on that very briefly. But yes, I didn't know if any of our other speakers wanted to chime in on what they've just heard.
I think we're concerned about the quality of early years as well. We want the quality of early years to be at a high standard that we are providing now. We're providing that from our own knowledge, from our own experience, from our own capacity to do that. But there's, people having to fund ourselves to go on training, fund ourselves to do things that will make us better practitioners. We shouldn't have to do that.
Yeah, I think for me, it's that confusion. Is it a back to work, maternal employment initiative, or are we actually focused on increasing the quality of early education?
I have an MP to happen to be passing. The business that you want me to transact, if I have the right note, is that you want me to propose that Lord Weir become an officer of the group, Kindred Square, Cooperative Childcare, and Leeds University Business School will become sponsors of the group. This is the All-Party Group on Childcare Early Education, so celebrate. You saw them about it, yeah. So they have the room in 4 minutes for a meeting of Kent MPs. So, it isn't getting any cooler in here, I'm sorry, chaps. But thank you so much. Is there anybody in the room who wanted to make a final comment before we wrap up? You got to go back. Nice to see you. Well done. You are done. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Did anyone want to say anything? This meeting is available on our YouTube channel afterwards for anybody who wants to watch it back. Sorry to slightly break away there, those that are listening. We just had to do the EGM bit while we had some MPs in the room.
Just one thing really briefly, I just think that what Catherine was saying earlier about serving the children with special needs, I think the number of children with special educational needs is underestimated by the current system. You see how late diagnosis comes through the school system, how there's an extended appeal system, almost all of which uphold the review. So I think there's a backed up number of children who would benefit from that extra support who are just not identified in that early period. And it also links to your points about COVID. The children who are now coming to the end of their early years time and will be entering school will probably be most affected by the lockdowns because they were, in their very early stage of full language development. They were 1 or 2, and they're the ones who are. That's quite a significant thing that happened to them for their first year, 18 months in particular. So that's sort of sorry to add to the issues, but that makes it back up. Those who are diagnosed with special education, probably brought out, I think it's twice what it is. But there's some concern to them. We're diagnosed now. What it does suggest that the other parts of them, there's a massive under diagnosis, recognition in that regard. But people out there within the whole very much think that was going to be a problem, so we can disappear. I think
Thank you, Lord Weir. I'm sorry to draw it from the close. As ever, demand outstrips supply in terms of rooms in this place, but the Kent MPs will be in very shortly. So thanks for joining us. Thank you to Shanti for presentation, for Josh from Nuffield, for Catherine on the screen, MBE, and for the team from Leeds for you. And there's a photo just up on the screen, which we just sharing with you now. I thought I'd like to end with a bit of good news. So it's yesterday morning in my constituency. So at the end of last year, Stepping Stones Nursery at Winnall Primary School in Winchester had a nasty flood. They came in after half term and it was flooded. And it's one of the poorest estates in Hampshire and in my constituency. And there's lots of very disadvantaged children in that area, and they were left with no preschool whatsoever. And we've been trying to fast track getting a new provider in because the old provider couldn't make it work given what happened. And this is Julie, who has a very early years hand on hip pose. Okay, this is Julie Taylor from Dungaroos, who already run a preschool in Winchester. And she stepped in, she's taken it on, and I'm going to go in the next few weeks with her and my paintbrushes and my leaf hoover to clear up the outside space, and this is going to be the new Dungaroos preschool place at Winnall Primary School. So it's a bit of good news, and she's going to be providing a brilliant service to a really challenged area that really needs it. So we salute you, Julie, and all the team for doing what they do. So that's it. Meeting closed. That's a bit of good news, isn't it? To end it,